and the proposed resolution that's being put forward to the Union of B.C. Municipalities. My name is Karen Tamwu, and I'm with the Pembina Institute, and Matt Horn, our regional director, will be walking you through some modeling results that we had commissioned looking at the impacts of this resolution, which was sponsored by New Westminster and endorsed by the Lower Mainland Local Government Association. We also have with us today Tom-Pierre Frappé-Sénéclose, who is running tech for us on the webinar. We'll have a session of question and answers following Matt's presentation. I did also want to note that Councillor Bill Harper with New Westminster, who is responsible for putting forward this resolution, sends his regards and was not able to join us for this webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining. So we're, as Karen mentioned, just going to walk through a presentation, a little bit of background first on the carbon tax in general, just to make sure sort of a common knowledge base. Take a look at the UBCM resolution itself and some modeling we've commissioned from Navius to take a look at that. Walk through the results, both from an economic and environmental perspective. Try to put those in a little bit of the context around where the next steps of this, both in terms of UBCM and some of the other processes that are underway, and then open it up to questions and discussion. Just before I dive right into it, I did want to also acknowledge the financial support from both Sustainable Prosperity and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions in making this project happen. So very appreciative of that support. And then also for Navius Research, who we commissioned to do the modeling on this, and using their modeling expertise for the work. And I think just before I dive in, a couple of reasons just in terms of the presentation being timely for a few reasons. One, well, UBCM is coming up next week, so we have interesting resolution put forward by New Westminster, so wanting to provide some additional context into the discussions around that resolution itself. And then also, I guess, sort of parallel to that, or overlapping with that, I have the province is in the process of developing its budget for 2016, and the Finance Committee is just starting their consultations. So definitely some relevance in terms of the carbon tax for that conversation, and then also the province is in the process of developing its climate leadership plan, and carbon tax obviously being an important discussion point and decision in that in terms of where the province heads with that into the future. So just to start in terms of a little bit of basics on this carbon tax 101, we've got, I think on balance, a pretty good body of evidence from the carbon tax over its first 7 years, and admittedly, I think still a relatively new policy. So I think as we continue to move forward, we're going to learn more about some things that are working and some things that aren't working. But on balance, the evidence has been very positive, both economically and environmentally to date. So the first slide here is showing per capita fossil fuel consumption in both BC and the rest of Canada. And you see they track each other quite closely up until the point where the carbon tax is implemented, and then start to diverge fairly noticeably. So in terms of reducing fossil fuel use, that's what we want to see as a result. And looking at this chart, we're seeing a fairly positive result there, and one where it wouldn't at all sort of pin that result entirely on the carbon tax. There's a number of other policies that have been put in place, such as the low carbon fuel standard or clean energy requirements that are part of BC's initial climate action plan that are all sort of all have an impact on fossil fuel use, but the carbon tax is definitely a foundational piece and an important part of that trend. Economically, again, I think we've got positive evidence, and this is just looking at the change in GDP. First of all, the blue line showing British Columbia. So we had the very significant drop in 2008, 2009, and then sort of an increase from there. And I think sort of if we look at the comparison with the rest of Canada, very, very minor differences. If you look at this on a per capita basis, BC would be slightly ahead of the rest of Canada. Either way, sort of looking at that, I think probably a stretch to say the carbon tax is significantly helping the economy, but there's definitely not evidence that it's hindering the economy in any way. In terms of public support for the policy, and I think anytime you ask around sort of, do you support a tax, or are you supportive of this tax, it's a hard one to get a positive response on. But on balance, the public opinion polling, this is some research that Environics Institute has done over the last 7 years, shows, I think, a reasonable degree of support. Last year, getting as high as 2/3 of British Columbians are supportive of the carbon tax. And also, I guess, from a low in July 2008, when we had record high gas prices, there's been a general upward trend in that degree of support as well. So both the degree of support and the general trend are encouraging on that front. And lastly, on sort of the background pieces here, just to talk a little bit about how the revenue is currently used from the carbon tax. And as structured, the carbon tax is revenue neutral. That was the decision the government made when they implemented it in 2008. This chart is showing carbon tax revenue. Carbon tax revenue is the red lines on the bar in each year. So starting relatively low because of the lower rate and brought in halfway through the year, and then raising up to about 1.2 billion in sort of the last couple of years in the fiscal year. And then, so the legislation in the Carbon Tax Act says that all the revenues collected have to be recycled to British Columbians or BC businesses in the form of tax cuts or credits. So you can see the blue chunks are the way the BC government has done that. So at the bottom is the low-income tax credits, designed to ensure there weren't negative impacts on low-income British Columbians. Personal income tax cuts being a big piece of it, corporate income tax cuts, and then the last part at the top, which has grown in recent years, is sort of a collection of other tax credits, such as the film tax credit and some property tax credits that are built into the carbon tax revenue recycling measures. So I think an important point is this is a decision the government made and a decision they've stuck to since it was implemented in 2008. It's not something that has to happen that way, and this is where the UBCM resolution from New Westminster comes in. I think there's an interesting conversation and discussion around what should be the best use of revenue from additional carbon tax revenues if those do materialize. And we can look around the world and whether around the world with different carbon tax and carbon pricing systems, and there's not a single answer in terms of how jurisdictions are doing that. So BC, with the first phase of its carbon tax, took a revenue neutral approach. And I think you can look at sort of the economic and environmental evidence, and it has been positive. Ireland, for example, used its carbon tax to eliminate deficits. Quebec, when it had its carbon tax, used that to finance green programs. So a range of approaches. I wouldn't say there's sort of one right or wrong answer on this, but what we wanted to do with the rest of the presentation is look in a little bit more detail at the resolution put forward by New Westminster to the UBCM. So the resolution itself is sponsored by New Westminster and endorsed by the Lower Mainland Local Government Association. In essence, what they proposed in that resolution is to restart annual increases into the carbon tax of $5 per tonne per year, and use the incremental revenue, instead of using it with the revenue neutrality model, use it to finance local and regional climate solutions. So there's the resolution doesn't get into a huge amount of detail in terms of what that would actually look like. So we wanted to at least provide a scenario that could represent that model. So we worked with Navius Research, which is a local energy economy modeling firm, to, I guess, provide a representation of that model. So we've built into the scenario, we'll present results from today, $5 a tonne annual increases starting in 2018, which is when the carbon tax freeze is scheduled to end, out to 2030. So that take the carbon tax rate to $95 a tonne in 2030. We've sort of developed a package of what that new revenue could be used for, including investing in transit, electric vehicles, building and home energy efficiency, and waste and reducing methane from waste and agricultural use. We've also built into that sort of scaling up the low income and northern rural tax credits. That's something that's not prescriptive in the resolution as proposed, but is included in the modeling results we're going to be presenting. In terms of the existing tax cuts and credits financed by the carbon tax, we've left those unchanged. So all the revenue collected from that first $30 a tonne continues to go towards the tax cuts and credits that were initially financed. So in terms of, I guess, rationale for the selection of those measures, this isn't intended to be sort of a perfect prescription of the best way to spend the revenue. We worked with Navius to sort of select a package of investments in climate solutions that seemed to fit the spirit of the resolution in terms of being relevant at a local or regional level. Also wanted to sort of put a lens on it, looking at making sure there were opportunities that were applicable around the province. So whether those are transit definitely being more applicable in sort of in larger communities, things like the agriculture and waste may be more applicable in rural communities. But I think on balance, we've got some that are applicable all around the province and some more specific to larger communities versus rural communities. Yeah, and so again, we really wanted to understand this and look at what the resolution could mean. I think if the province does eventually go down this path, you'd certainly want to do more work in terms of the specific balance between the opportunities and how much exactly makes sense to invest in them. So to start with, in terms of results, first, just from a carbon perspective, this is the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions between 2015 and 2030 under the scenario. So you do get a slight decline of about 4%, 3% in emissions. And I think for most people sort of looking at this from a climate perspective and looking from the province's targets, it's definitely an underwhelming result. And there's a number of reasons for that I wanted to touch on quickly. So one, the package of policies, which is in essence the increase in the carbon tax and investing the revenue in climate solutions, stops in 2030. So there's no new policy such as an increase in the carbon tax or an increase in what the revenue is used for post 2030. So we just for simplicity stopped it at 2030. And if you're imagining a business or a household making a decision in 2028 or 2029, having that policy plateau at that point is different than if it were to continue to increase. The other important limitation is that this is a modeling exercise on the UBCM resolution. It's not a modeling exercise on an overall climate plan. So there's a number of opportunities to strengthen the province's climate plan, and we haven't made any attempt to sort of model what all those policies would look like. That's certainly something that the province is doing as part of their own climate leadership plan process, but it's not there in part of this exercise. So for example, where there are gaps in the province's current climate framework, we haven't made any attempt to fill those as this modeling exercise, and you would certainly want to do that as part of a successful climate leadership plan. And the other thing, just if you split these results out, so these are the total emissions, but if we sort of split it in terms of industry and freight, and the lower piece, buildings, personal transportation, and waste, so the yellow bar here is essentially sort of where all of the sort of investment is targeted, and you do have a much more encouraging trend. So instead of that 3% drop, you're looking at just over a 40% drop over that 15-year period, which again is sort of the trajectory, the type of trajectory we should be targeting for the entire province's emissions. We actually see an increase of 16% in industry and freight, and it's sort of a combined factor of one, the underlying assumption this model do have some LNG and increased natural gas development in them. So it's taken from a sort of a starting point scenario. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at sort of what other options are. That's certainly an area you'd want to do some scenario analysis around. But that, in combination with some gaps in the province's climate framework that aren't addressed in this modeling exercise, do lead to increasing emissions from the industry and freight, which are in essence not touched by the decisions we made around what the investment will be targeted towards. So looking economically, this is, I think, sort of in both cases we have job indicators and GDP indicators. Both are quite promising. So you've got, I guess, similar to the experience with the carbon tax to date, we've got increasing jobs sort of up by 36% between 2015 and 2030, and on a GDP side, a 37% increase. So no flags in terms of opportunity for economic growth and opportunity for jobs growth in the province. One thing I should comment on, and this is relevant to the results, we had to make assumptions around what happens in the rest of North America and the rest of the world around climate policy. In this case, we've assumed that I guess the entire world is moving in this direction, and that you have BC being in a leadership position, but not in a dramatic one. So I think if that scenario changes, you'd have a differing outcomes, and you probably would have to do some specific targeted measures to address competitiveness. That's not something that we built into this, so it, in essence, takes care of itself by other jurisdictions moving in the same direction, but a step or two behind where BC is moving in this scenario. In terms of the revenue, this chart's showing the carbon tax revenue and what it is allocated towards. So the gray bar at the bottom is sort of that starting point, $30 a ton we're currently at. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not sort of changing what that's allocated for. It does decline slightly over time, and that's because the emissions in the province are declining slightly, so that the revenue from that $30 a ton and the tax cuts and credits it would finance shrink slightly over time as well. We've scaled up the northern and rural benefits and the low-income tax credit in this package. So they essentially, in terms of total dollars, both triple between 2015 and 2030. And then you can see the investment in local climate solutions being the orange bar at the top. And it starts at a relatively small amount of 161 million in 2018 because it matches the increase in the carbon tax. It gets up to about $2 billion by 2030, so certainly not a negligible amount in 15 years. And yeah, so it's just a comment in terms of the model we've used with Navius. It does capture sort of the interaction, so that the slight decline in emissions is sort of built in and feeds back with the model. So the carbon tax revenue is based on what the actual emissions are predicted to be, not what they are today or what they would be without the policy. In terms of what you'd be able to achieve with those results, the combined investment from the carbon tax revenue and leverage funding. So we also have built in some assumptions around when the province invests in transit, for example, they're typically sort of is able to leverage funding from the federal government. Or if there's been investments in building energy efficiency, there's often leverage funding from utilities, for example. So we have built in some assumptions based on past experience there. So over that 15-year period, there's a total investment of $20.5 billion from those combined sources. 70% of which is from carbon tax revenue and about 30% coming from those leverage sources. So that's going to be enough to retrofit over 500,000 homes, build over 500,000 new net zero ready homes and buildings, add 2 rapid transit lines and 20 express bus routes, put 300,000 vehicles on the road, and achieve a 95% organic waste diversion by 2025. So that's again, sort of the package of measures we had built in at a starting point, and where there's sort of what could be achieved with those results. And again, it's not a prescription of sort of the absolute best way to invest those dollars. We haven't sort of attempted this exercise in terms of where your biggest bang for your buck is, either economically or politically. This is sort of a package of investments that does seem to have support around the province, and but definitely some refinement needed on the exact amounts that would be appropriate in those different categories if you did follow this path. One interesting result that comes out of this is in terms of average household energy and carbon costs. And I think I was certainly surprised with these results. And there's a perception that as we sort of, because of increasing electricity rates or increasing carbon taxes, the amount households are going to be paying on energy and carbon is going up. And actually, we're seeing the opposite. So these are both in 2015 dollars. So, and you do get this interesting result of household energy costs and carbon costs actually coming down. And so the biggest change in there is you're seeing the green bar shrink fairly significantly. So that's in part some shift into transit, and also vehicles being much more efficient than they are today. So as a result, even if like in 20-30 dollars, the price per liter of gasoline and the carbon tax value are going to be higher than they are today, the amount being used is much less. So that the overall household bill for energy is dropping by over $1,000. And just to reiterate, in addition to that, as we built into this, there is that scaling up of the low-income tax credits. So when you're looking at lower income households, we should, over that time period, see some reductions in the carbon footprint and also increased protection to ensure there isn't a regressive impact of the tax policy. The last piece in terms of results we wanted to show was just comparing the UBCM resolution with a revenue neutral approach. So what this has is the same carbon tax schedule, so going from $30 a ton in 2018 up to the $95 a ton in 2030. So the blue bars show, like I said, the blue bars show what you'd get from a revenue neutral approach. So again, basically mirroring the package of tax cuts, or extending the package of tax cuts and credits that the province currently has in place versus the approach we've modeled with trying to represent the UBCM resolution. So you do get, you can see there on the left, the carbon emissions. So it's about a 5% improvement in carbon emissions in the UBCM resolution. So the investments do help reduce emissions, not surprisingly. And if we look at the GDP side, it's hard to pick up in the graph, but there is a slight trade-off involved here. So where you're getting about a 5%, a little more than a 5% uptick in carbon performance, you do have at a cost of 0.3% of GDP. So the revenue neutral approach does give you slightly higher growth in GDP. Again, in both cases, you're getting it ends up being sort of 37 or 37.3% growth in GDP, but it sort of illustrates the trade-off. So it's, again, this is a bit of another surprising result for me. I was expecting a more pronounced trade-off between these two, but based on the modeling anyways, it's a smaller impact economically than we might have anticipated. In terms of next steps, just to put this in sort of context going forward, UBCM obviously next week, and this is one of the resolutions that would be put forward for the convention. So hopefully in terms of local government guests participating today, this is useful information. And a couple of things we will be doing is providing just a brief backgrounder on these results, so it's there as additional information, and we'll also, a brief backgrounder available that we'll be making available on our website and the participants of the webinar. It'll likely go out tomorrow, but just as a little bit more information, more or less covering the information we presented here, but that'll be there to help inform the debate and discussion around that resolution. The province is also in the process of it running its consultations for the 2016 budget. So that's a committee made up of both BC Liberal and BC NDP MLAs that travels the province over the next month and a half, running sort of public hearings to take input and comment on the budget. So again, the future of the carbon tax and what happens post-carbon tax freeze, I think, is an important point for that committee to be considering. And at the end of their process, the combination of the formal presentations they've received and also written submissions they've received will be used to inform their report and recommendations to the finance minister. And lastly, the climate leadership plan, which is the update to the 2008 climate action plan that the province is in the process of developing. And I think it's not a surprise to anyone that given the carbon tax was sort of a central piece of the 2008 climate action plan, the decisions on the next steps in the carbon tax are certainly important ones to inform that climate leadership plan. So again, there's a public consultation on that just closed. The province will be releasing its draft plan in late November in advance of the Paris climate talks in December. So again, there'll be a follow-up consultation on that draft plan. So in terms of interest and perspectives around the carbon tax and the climate plan more generally, certainly an opportunity to engage. And we would encourage people to take that opportunity. So with that, I thank people for joining and turn it over to Karen to moderate our questions.
Thanks, Matt. So for folks on the line, the way to ask a question is to type a question into the chat box that you have on your screen. And I forgot to mention that at the outset so that you could keep track of your questions as Matt was doing his presentation. But feel free to do that now. One question that we have for folks on the line is if there are other ideas for investments that local governments might be interested in with the carbon tax revenue. And one question that we have that has been posed is this Pembina Institute's perspective on the carbon tax, or what's the difference between what the resolution is proposing and what the Pembina Institute has endorsed as your position on the carbon tax in their climate leadership plan submission, because they seem a little bit different.
Thanks. It's a good question. So this is what we've modeled here today and presented on is a resolution put forward by New Westminster and our attempt to represent that resolution. So Pembina's perspective and what we provided into the climate leadership plan process in August is a bit different. So I think the elements are quite similar. We've definitely been supportive of an increase in the carbon tax rate. The actual sort of rate we proposed to the province was an increase of $5 to $10 a ton per year, depending on the modeling that the province does. So I think we need to get more information on what sort of rates are needed to enable the province to meet its targets. We've been supportive of increasing investment in climate solutions around the province. We haven't in our submission explicitly linked those two in the same way that the New Westminster resolution does. So if that was a direction the province took, we'd be supportive of it. Similarly, though, if they took a direction more in line with the 2008 climate plan, when the carbon tax was brought in, they actually did have pretty significant investment in climate change initiatives in that budget, even though the carbon tax was designed in a revenue neutral way. So those came out of other pots of the budget. But they still went towards climate solutions. So I think at assessment, we'd be supportive of increasing the rate and supportive of investing in climate solutions. And you can make that link if you want to, but at the end of the day, it probably doesn't need to be made to achieve the same results. The other, just 2 points to stress in terms of Pembina's perspective, we have been supportive of increasing the low-income tax credit if there is any increase in the carbon tax rate. That's something we did model and is built into the scenario we presented today. It's not explicitly there or not there as part of the UBCM resolution. And the last piece we've commented on and encouraged the province to move forward with is a broadening of the carbon tax. So there's some gaps in the coverage of the carbon tax that were in place when it was brought in. It covers pretty much all combustion sources, but doesn't cover some of the non-combustion sources, such as methane venting from the natural gas sector or some industrial process emissions. We think the province should broaden it to cover those sources now. So again, that's one that's not explicitly in or in the UBCM resolution. It doesn't comment on it at all.
Thanks for that. So we have a question here about the 300,000 electric vehicles and buildings, and assuming that this is happening through incentives or rebates as opposed to full capital cost, could you provide some more details on that?
So, yeah, there's a bit more detail here, and we can provide a bit more in the follow-up information as well. So what we built into the modeling is for the building improvements, for the electric vehicles, and also some of the methane reduction opportunities, is that the carbon tax revenue is used to pay for the difference between those technologies. So if an electric vehicle costs $4,000 more than a conventional vehicle, the carbon tax revenue is used to close that gap. So it's one of the pieces. One I didn't mention as well, just sort of worth commenting on, for the buildings as well. It's not. There is a little bit more built in than just the revenue itself. So the revenue is there as an investment. In this case, it's actually more designed as a compensation. So the modeling assumes those changes are going to happen. So a move towards net zero buildings, for example, and then recognizing those could represent or they would represent an additional cost, at least initially, using the carbon tax revenue to help pay for the extra work expected of households or of businesses. But in terms of more detailed breakdowns on sort of the costs involved or sort of the rollout of of those improvements, that will be in the background or that we'll be sharing later this week. So if there's further information people are looking for on that, we're happy to provide it as well.
All right, there's a question that says, according to the 2013 National Inventory Report from Environment Canada, BC's emissions are increasing right now. Can you comment on that? And can the carbon tax help reverse this trend? Would it need to apply to industrial and LNG emissions?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I tried to touch on this a little bit on one of the earlier slides, but the province's emissions, I think there's been some sort of, I think, what we would characterize as success from a 2008 through 2012 window, in large part because of the province's initial climate action plan and the policies in place in that. But there has been a plateau or a stall in that climate action plan, and we haven't seen any new policies implemented. Largely as a result, we're now seeing the projections from Environment Canada showing that BC's emissions are going to be increasing over the next 5 years, which is sort of the window at which they provide their projections for. And that's, I think, something that's been acknowledged by the province in the creation of the Climate Leadership Plan, and that they're not on track for the targets they've set. If the province is going to achieve those, it's in essence is going to require a ramp up of policies. Basically, I think everything that has been working in the climate action plan, so things like the carbon tax, the low carbon fuel standard, the clean energy requirements are all going to need to be strengthened in the climate leadership plan. And there's also, in all likelihood, a need to complement that with some additional strategies. Industrial emissions and LNG and natural gas definitely, I think, represent an elevated challenge. It's not the only challenge, though, by any means. So you're going to need policy across the economy if there's any chance of seeing emissions decline substantially in the province.
All right. We have a little bit more time for questions, so we might just leave it open for another minute or so to see if there's any further questions out there. All right, so you noted that you ran the analysis at $5 a year. Do you have a sense of what might happen at $10 per ton per year?
We haven't done that as part of this modeling. I think we know you get more of a response in terms of reduced emissions. We don't have the detailed results on those at this point. There's probably 3 variables of interest around sort of that carbon tax rate that are worth looking at. So one would be what a faster ramp would look like. So instead of $5 a ton per year, what would $10 a ton per year look like for the province's emissions and for the province's economy? Secondly, I mentioned this earlier, would be what are the implications of extending that schedule post-2030? We didn't have the resources to do a number of scenarios, so we've capped it at 2030 in this scenario. But again, people are going to be making forward-looking decisions, not based on just what the prices are today, but what they might be in the future. So extending that rate out further into the future will definitely have, again, you're going to achieve more in terms of emissions reductions. We don't know exactly how much more. And the last would be an issue around coverage. So in modeling the UBCM resolution, it doesn't at all doesn't propose any changes on coverage of the carbon tax, but it's certainly been an opportunity that has been discussed in the province. So including some of the non-combustion sources that are currently not covered by the carbon tax. And again, we knew we would get more reductions, in particular if you're looking at some of the methane emissions in the natural gas sector tend to be very low cost opportunities, and those don't currently have an incentive to be reduced. So you would get more. We don't have details at this point on how much more. So the province is doing modeling on that. I also know Clean Energy Canada has done some modeling in this around sort of the climate leadership plan and where they're seeing opportunities for the province, and that's something that they're working towards releasing in the fairly near future. So I think we're building an evidence and knowledge base around sort of potential future pathways in the carbon tax, but definitely still some gaps and opportunities to understand more.
Great. What are your thoughts on the political acceptability of a non-neutral tax increase?
It's a good question. You definitely, like, you can talk to 5 people and get 5 different perspectives on this one pretty easily. The government has been, I think, certainly through the first phase of the carbon tax, very supportive and behind the concept of revenue neutrality. And there's some positive evidence to point to in terms of both economically and environmentally from that first phase. There's also lots of people, as evidenced by the UBCM resolution, that would like to see a move towards other uses of the carbon tax revenue. We've done, actually, I think I can still advance slide, but we have a slide here. This is some public opinion research we did a couple years ago that was looking at public perspectives on different investment opportunities from carbon tax revenue. So the question was basically there's no further increases planned for the carbon tax, but asked people if they would support or oppose future increases based on different uses. So the blue bars here are essentially sort of where there's support for different ideas. You actually saw like support almost at sort of 60% or higher for the first 4 we tested, and those were investing in other government priorities like healthcare and education. The second one, investing in climate solutions, reducing personal income taxes, and protecting low income. So there's, I think, a pretty reasonable degree of support across the spectrum for those. The last one, in terms of reducing corporate income taxes, very little support for that concept. So there's a couple pieces in here. My sense is that like there's space for a fairly broad range of approaches, and again, it's going to depend on the government's leanings, but where they can build support for next steps in a carbon tax. Part of that's going to depend on I think they will need to communicate that fairly effectively, and it's going to need to be packaged as part of a broader climate leadership plan. So if it's just a carbon tax and that's all the government is offering, I think that can be pretty underwhelming and difficult to support. But if it's a piece of a broader transition to a cleaner energy economy, as evidenced in BC, you can build support for that type of policy. One other piece that's sort of embedded in this, and I think there's a challenge in communicating the carbon tax, in that the carbon tax itself and that making fossil fuels more expensive achieve something on its own. So regardless of what the revenue is used for, whether it's revenue neutral, it's going to climate solutions, or going into general revenue, that addition on fossil fuels, whether it's coal or natural gas or oil, is encouraging a shift to higher levels of energy efficiency and is encouraging a shift to more renewable energy. And that often does get lost in the conversation. So I think it's the fact that built into the UBCM resolution is a proposal to continue increasing the carbon tax is really important. And we often lose sight of that and sort of jump right to the conversation about revenue. And the conversation around revenue is an important one, but it's only half of the overall conversation.
So here's a question that it kind of is a good piggyback on what you just said. Did I hear correctly that the cost per ton would increase from $35 to $95 under this scenario? And if so, the graph should showing only a 5% reduction by 2030 seems like a small impact for a large increase in costs. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can flip back to that chart. So yeah, and I think it's a little underwhelming looking at that sort of overall result, that we're targeting like a third cut by 2020 and 80% cut by 2050. Those are the province's legislated targets. That's what the climate leadership plan has said it's going to produce a plan for. So this UBCM resolution on its own definitely doesn't pass that test. There's a little more conversation around that that's important to know. So if you look at the bottom bar here in terms of buildings, personal transportation, and waste, you are seeing a trajectory and or emissions declines that are getting in line with those sort of targets. Where we're challenged is sort of on the industry and freight side. And there's two reasons for that. One, there's not a full package of policies in what you would expect for in a climate leadership plan. We've only modeled the UBCM resolution. So there's some specific policies around, well, some of the gaps in coverage in the natural gas sector or industrial process emissions are a pretty important piece that, again, in this scenario, don't have any policy applying to them. So that's a gap you would expect to see filled in a climate leadership plan. The other, and there has been a lot of conversation around the province in this, is the challenge represented by liquefied natural gas. And it's not something that the model predicts per se. So built into here, we didn't have a lot of discussion around them in advance because it wasn't an exercise to meet the targets. But there is one LNG project built in here, and it takes the National Energy Board's forecast of increasing gas production in BC. So if you do have that increase in activity, you're going to need really strong policies to meet the targets. Again, that's in part the carbon tax. It could be a higher rate in the carbon tax. It could be complementary policies, or it could be both. But that's not in here at the moment. So the UBC resolution on its own is not enough to get to the targets the province has proposed.
So following on the same question, what would happen if the carbon tax was extended to industry? Would the same level of decline happen?
Thanks. And just to clarify, it's not a gap for industry. It's a gap for combustion versus non-combustion emissions. So industry pays the carbon tax, and freight pays the carbon tax on all the fossil fuels they burn. The carbon tax is not charged in the province to any non-combustion sources. So that does include some fairly significant sources in the natural gas sector. It would also include landfills, which include a lot of residential and commercial waste. So it's not just an industry household split. It's a combustion versus non-combustion split. What would happen? So we don't have great modeling. We don't have any modeling in this. We modeled just an increase in the carbon tax. We didn't model a change in the coverage. If you were to broaden the coverage, so the current coverage is roughly 70% of the province's emissions, and you could definitely bring in some of the additional non-combustion sources to increase that. What you're in essence doing is spreading the load or effort of reducing emissions across a broader set of the economy. So if you're trying to reduce emissions by a third, which the province is doing, and you're doing that on 70% of the emissions base, you can achieve that, but you're missing 30% of the opportunities. As you start broadening the carbon tax or broadening your climate policies, you go after more and more opportunities. So there definitely, if we look at what's not covered by the carbon tax, there are some good opportunities, and probably the best one would be methane that leaks from the natural gas sector. So if there's in pipelines or valves, for example, try to keep as much of the methane or natural gas in those systems as possible, but some does leak out and some is vented on purpose for various industrial purposes. Pretty much every case there's sort of a technology or practice that could reduce those emissions. Right now there's not a regulation or an incentive from the province's climate policy to require those sort of changes. Broadening the carbon tax would provide that incentive for industry to do so, and we don't have detailed results as to how much you would achieve, but it's definitely more than what's achieved in the results presented here.
Would you be able to provide some context about how this carbon tax compares with other examples in the world?
Yep. So there's definitely not a one-size-fits-all or a standard carbon tax or carbon pricing system around the world. If we're looking at other carbon taxes around the world, BC's is, I think, quite widely praised, and so it includes sort of the World Bank or the OECD for the simplicity of its approach. So it has, notwithstanding the non-combustion gaps in coverage we just talked about, it does have quite broad coverage, and it has the same rate across the economy. So you do get a consistent and simple signal to reduce emissions, compared to something like Norway or Sweden, which have had longer standing carbon taxes. They have some sectors where they're paying a higher rate and some sectors where they're paying a lower rate. So the average cost across the economy is comparable amongst sort of the highest in the world, but it would definitely sort of rank up there as one of the more simple, or one of the simplest. The other, I think, piece that has earned BC a fair bit of praise from its carbon tax was the initial schedule that was built in. So they had, when they first implemented it, it was accompanied by a 5-year schedule of rate increases that did give people and businesses the opportunity to plan and say it's a pretty low rate today, but it's going to be a bit higher in 5 years, so maybe I should make decisions based on that higher rate as opposed to the rate I'm paying today. That's something we've seen in some carbon taxes, but more often than not, we'd probably see a rate set, and then a few years later, a government might revisit it. In terms of comparison with cap and trade systems that are out there, and certainly looking at North America, Quebec and California are part of a cap and trade system, and Ontario is proposing to join them. The price in BC is higher, so the price in BC is $30 a ton. The trading price, which would be the equivalent metric in that cap and trade system, is about $15 a ton. And the other benefit, in my opinion, of BC's carbon tax, it's applying to 100% of the emissions that are within the scope. So if you're burning fossil fuels, you essentially have an incentive to get all the way to zero. You could switch, you could use a more efficient or a less carbon intensive fossil fuel and get a little bit of the way, but you've got an incentive to go all the way zero and use renewable energy. Whereas under the cap and trade system, for example, many industries are only paying on a portion of their emissions and don't necessarily have an incentive to go all the way to zero because of the way those systems have been designed.
Here's a question on scaling up of the Northern and Rural Tax Credit and why increase that credit? Are they being hit harder by a carbon tax?